Hi everybody, this is Rebecca Newkirk, a licensed clinical social worker in New Mexico, Virginia, and Washington, D.C. And I wanted to talk today a little bit about hypervigilance and how it manifests for people who have complex trauma, because it does look a little bit different than it might look for someone who has more acute trauma or what we would normally consider to be PTSD. I guess the first thing that we need to talk about here is the difference between PTSD and CPTSD, which is complex trauma. And a lot of the time when we're talking about PTSD, we're talking about an acute or discrete event that happens, something like a car accident or an assault that happens one time, maybe by a stranger. It is absolutely traumatizing. It is absolutely terrifying and makes us feel like we might die in the moment, and that's what creates the trauma response. However, when we're talking about complex PTSD, a lot of the time we're talking about a chronic experience of emotional abandonment or emotional abuse, and not feeling safe in especially caregiver relationships through our childhood. And a lot of the time, complex trauma starts to develop at least during our developmental periods. So a lot of the time we're talking about things that happened in your childhood. One of the major differences that you might have heard me already allude to is that CPTSD oftentimes is relationship trauma. So it's trauma in the experience of attachments or in the experience of feeling like you don't have a safe place to fall. I think you might already be able to see where I'm going with this. So hypervigilance, when we're talking about normal or like typical PTSD, might sound like, looking both ways like 4 or 5 times before you cross the street, maybe in excess of times. It might mean listening for sounds that are out of the ordinary or that perk you up or relate back to the trauma that you had. When we're talking about hypervigilance with CPTSD, it's a little bit harder to spot because a lot of the time we're looking at actually hyper-focusing on the people in our lives and their mood. And we start focusing on things like their body language and their demeanor and slight changes in their inflection or the tone of voice that they're using. And sometimes this can be really helpful, actually, and that's part of why I wanted to talk about it today. But it can also be an incredibly painful experience because basically I call it chess gaming. You're basically chess gaming your way through life and through relationships. You're always trying to think multiple steps ahead and not really able to be present and in the moment in the relationship with the person who's important to you. So this can do a lot of damage to relationships. It can also be like very emotionally exhausting, and it can also be frustrating because the amount of effort and energy that you're putting in to make sure that you're emotionally available and doing the right thing for your spouse or to be comforting to the people who are important to you, maybe the people who are important to you don't really know how to provide that back to you. And if they don't have the same background that you do in, having narcissistic relationships or being emotionally abused or abandoned or having just an inconsistent caregiver when they were younger, then they're probably not going to be able to do the same things that you're doing inside of the relationship. They're not going to notice the slight tilt of your head and the fact that that means that maybe your feelings were hurt or that your tone of voice dipped just slightly and that means something about your feelings as well. So I guess one of the major reasons that I wanted to talk about this today is because it's actually a pretty cool thing. Like there's a negative pull, we just talked about that, but there's also a positive pull here. And I think that's true of every aspect of being human, like every aspect of who we are. Like there's always a way that we can interact with it and engage with it that can be negative and detracting from our enjoyment of our lives. And then there's also, usually, I would say, I'm not going to say all the time, I don't have that amount of confidence in it, but I feel like most of the time there's a positive pole that we can be interacting with as well. And the positive pole of this CPTSD hypervigilance is that you are amazing at being able to be supportive and present in your relationships in terms of providing emotional support to the people you care about in the way that they need from you. You're picking up on tiny little changes that maybe they don't even know that they're expressing to you. Now, again, looking at the possible negative pull of this, you might be doing that to the exclusion of your own needs. It might be something that's reflexive for you instead of a choice that you're making. I would argue that it would be important to explore this and identify how you can turn this into a choice that you're making, because once it is a choice and once it's something that you decide either to engage with or not to engage with, suddenly this is just incredible social skills. Like, this is something that you just have a lot more information about how the people around you are doing and what they're needing from you, and that's pretty amazing. So I thought it might brighten your day or evening to know that you might have a complex PTSD superpower in your relationships. It doesn't all have to be bad. So if you have any thoughts, comments, or questions about this, please feel free to leave them in the comments. I'd be happy to talk to you about it. And in the meantime, I will talk to you soon. Bye.